The night that destroyed her life did not begin with cruelty, but with music, wine, and laughter echoing through one of the greatest halls the ancient world had ever seen. A palace built to make men believe they stood inside the body of an empire, where marble floors reflected torchlight like liquid gold, and the air smelled of incense, roasted meat, and power. And at the center of it all sat Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of lands so vast that no map could contain them, a man worshipped by some as divine and feared by all as absolute, while nearby stood his daughter, barely 14, trained since childhood to lower her eyes, to move only when commanded, to exist beautifully and silently in a world that praised obedience as virtue. And as the wine flowed and the night grew heavier, something shifted, because Persian banquets were not merely celebrations. They were political theaters where words could shape destiny. And when Xerxes rose unsteadily to his feet, flushed with drink and surrounded by generals, nobles, and foreign envoys, the hall fell silent, not out of respect, but fear, because a drunk king was more dangerous than a sober one. And in that charged stillness he made a vow, swearing by the gods of Persia that any request made of him that night would be granted. A promise spoken too loudly, too proudly, and too publicly to ever be undone. And somewhere among the guests an old general understood immediately what this meant, because power reveals the darkest desires of those who stand closest to it. And when the request came, it did not ask for land or gold or titles, but for a living person, for the girl standing frozen beside the throne, her father's own blood. And in that instant the music died, the torches flickered, and the empire held its breath, because refusal would shatter the image Xerxes had built of himself as a god-king whose word could never bend, and acceptance would sacrifice something far more fragile than reputation. And when he spoke a single word, granting the request, applause erupted like thunder, not from joy, but from relief, because no one had to challenge him. And the girl understood then what no tutor had ever taught her, that in this palace, love was weakness, silence was survival, and blood meant nothing when weighed against pride. And as her mother turned away in shame, and the general smiled in triumph, she remained standing, swallowed by a realization that would follow her for years, that her body, her future, and her suffering now belonged to the empire. And this moment, this single drunken sentence, was not an accident, but the true beginning of a punishment history would later struggle to name, because what awaited her was not death, but something far worse, a slow erasure carried out behind closed doors, sanctioned by tradition, sealed by silence, and hidden so carefully that even centuries later, historians would argue over whether it had truly happened at all. And as the banquet resumed and laughter returned, the girl's story vanished into the palace walls, where screams were never heard, records were never written, and the next stage of her torment was already being prepared in the dark. To understand why no one stopped what happened that night, you must first understand the world she was born into, because the Persian royal court was not a family. It was a system, carefully designed to preserve power at any cost, where children of the king were raised less as sons and daughters and more as assets, shaped from birth to serve political needs they would never be allowed to question. And within the palace walls everything followed strict, ancient rules enforced not by guards alone, but by tradition itself, a tradition so powerful that even kings rarely dared to challenge it. And for royal daughters, the rules were especially suffocating, because they were visible in ceremony, yet invisible in choice, dressed in jewels yet locked away in silence, praised as symbols of divine blood, while being denied the most basic human freedom. And from the moment she could walk, the girl learned that her life belonged to others, that eunuchs would decide where she went, tutors would decide what she learned, and unseen priests would decide her fate long before she was old enough to understand the meaning of it. And while the empire celebrated Xerxes as a living god, those closest to him lived in constant fear. Because proximity to absolute power did not protect, it exposed. And the women of the royal household understood this better than anyone, as they lived in a sealed world of corridors and courtyards where whispers carried more danger than screams, and where affection from the king, especially toward a daughter born of a concubine, was not a blessing but a warning, because attention meant visibility, and visibility meant vulnerability, and ancient sources hint that Xerxes kept her close longer than custom allowed, refusing to send her away in early political marriage as was typical. And this delay, mistaken by some as kindness, quietly marked her as different, as something owned more personally. And in the Persian worldview, ownership mattered more than blood, because a king did not rule by love. He ruled by control, and control required sacrifice. And the court had seen this before, though never spoken aloud, as royal women were offered to secure loyalty, silence rivals, or reward service, their suffering wrapped in ritual language to make it seem honorable rather than cruel. And everyone in the palace understood the unspoken truth that the king's word was not guided by morality, but by image. Because to appear weak, indecisive, or bound by emotion was more dangerous than injustice itself. And so when that banquet oath was spoken, the machinery of the court began moving instantly, not to protect the girl, but to justify what was coming. As priests recalled precedents, scribes prepared omissions, and elders reminded one another that the gods themselves demanded obedience to vows, especially those sworn publicly, and within hours the event was no longer seen as a mistake, but as destiny, framed as tradition, sealed by religion and defended by fear. And the girl, now stripped of identity and reduced to a problem that needed resolving, was escorted back into the inner chambers, where silence pressed in thicker than stone. And though she still breathed, still lived, the court had already decided something chilling, that what would happen to her was necessary, acceptable, and above all, forgettable. And as torches dimmed and doors closed behind her, the next phase of her suffering began, hidden from the empire she symbolized, and protected by a silence that history itself would later struggle to break. Asterisk. What followed the banquet was not chaos, but procedure, because the Persian court did not act in rage. It acted in ritual, and rituals are far more dangerous than impulse, as they allow cruelty to wear the mask of necessity. And in the days after the vow, the girl was not treated like a victim. She was treated like a matter to be resolved, escorted through corridors she had known all her life, yet never truly seen, down into chambers reserved for decisions that could not survive daylight, where priests, court elders, and royal women gathered not to ask what was right, but to decide how the king's promise could be fulfilled without damaging the illusion of order. And this was where the true punishment began, because the court understood something chilling, that public disgrace would provoke outrage, but ritualized suffering would pass unnoticed, and so her fate was reshaped into ceremony, wrapped in language of honor, obedience, and divine will. And ancient sources hint at a sanctioned process, used rarely, spoken of only in fragments, a practice designed to remove a royal woman from history without spilling royal blood, because blood carried political consequences, while silence did not. And under this system she was stripped of her name, her status quietly altered, her existence reframed so that scribes would no longer record her as a daughter of the king, but as something lesser, something that could be moved, confined, and controlled without question. And this transformation was not announced. It was enacted slowly, through isolation, through rules that tightened day by day, through the removal of familiar attendants and the replacement of guards who did not speak her language. And every step was justified as tradition, as protection, as mercy. And this was the most cruel deception of all, because nothing about what followed was merciful, as she was relocated to a sealed wing of the palace complex, far from public courtyards and ceremonial halls, a place where women existed outside time, waiting not for release, but for erasure. And here her education ended, her contact with family vanished, and her life became defined by obedience to rules that were never explained, because explanation would have implied choice, and choice had already been taken from her, and the court moved quickly to ensure that memory itself would fade, instructing scribes to omit her name from future genealogies, ordering servants under threat of death to speak nothing of what they saw, and reminding everyone involved that loyalty to the king meant loyalty to silence. And as weeks passed, the empire outside continued uninterrupted. Wars were planned, taxes collected, monuments built, while inside these walls a young life was being dismantled piece by piece, not through violence that left marks, but through a method far more effective: the removal of identity, agency, and hope. And this was the ritual history rarely records, because it left no ruins and no bodies, only absences. And as the doors closed behind her for the final time, the court believed the problem was solved, unaware that in trying to bury the truth, they had created a shadow that would one day seep back into history, carrying a story far darker than any they meant to hide. Years passed, but time inside the sealed quarters did not move forward the way it did beyond the palace walls, because for her, life became a loop of controlled days and measured breaths, a slow punishment designed not to kill the body, but to hollow it out from within. And this was the brilliance of the system that trapped her, because death would have drawn attention, but survival allowed the empire to pretend nothing had happened at all. And every morning she woke under rules that governed even the smallest movements: when to rise, when to eat, when to speak, when to remain silent, watched constantly by attendants whose loyalty belonged not to her, but to the institution that erased her. And she learned quickly that resistance did not bring relief, it brought isolation, longer silences, fewer privileges, and colder rooms. Because this place was not meant for rebellion, it was meant for obedience without witnesses. And outside, Xerxes continued to rule, celebrated in inscriptions, praised in ceremonies, remembered as a conqueror, while his daughter faded into a living shadow, spoken of by no one, named nowhere. And this was not accidental, because in the Persian court, forgetting was an act of power, and those who were forgotten were considered resolved. And over time, the weight of that forgetting became heavier than chains, because no matter how much pain she endured, no one would ever acknowledge it. And the women who lived near her, some older, some younger, understood this truth too well, because they had seen it before. Women who had been inconvenient, politically dangerous, or simply unwanted, hidden away under the language of protection and honor, their lives reduced to quiet endurance. And as seasons changed, she was allowed fewer visitors, fewer comforts, fewer reminders that she had once been someone else. And the cruelty of it all lay in how carefully it was administered. Never extreme enough to provoke scandal, never gentle enough to allow hope. And ancient writers would later struggle to describe this kind of suffering because it did not fit heroic narratives of death or martyrdom. It was a punishment that unfolded privately, invisibly and endlessly, and the psychological toll was immense, because each day forced her to confront the same truth, that her father's decision had not been a mistake he regretted, but a choice he maintained through silence. And that silence became louder than any scream, echoing through every corridor she was no longer allowed to leave. And as the years accumulated, so did the realization that this was not temporary, that there would be no apology, no rescue, No moment when the king would remember her as a daughter instead of a liability. And by the time 14 years had passed, the girl who had once stood in a banquet hall, surrounded by music, no longer existed in any meaningful way, replaced by someone shaped entirely by confinement, obedience, and loss. And this was the final cruelty of the punishment, that she lived long enough to understand that what had been taken from her could never be returned, and that history itself would move on without ever speaking her name, setting the stage for a truth so disturbing that even centuries later, historians would hesitate before uncovering it. Asterisk, what makes her story even more unsettling is not only what happened to her, but how thoroughly it was buried, because the Persian Empire was meticulous about memory, carving victories into stone while allowing inconvenient truths to dissolve into silence. And when later generations searched for her name, they found only gaps, deliberate absences where a royal daughter should have been recorded. And this was not coincidence, because in empires built on divine authority, forgetting was a political tool, and erasing a victim was easier than admitting a flaw in the image of a god-king. And so official inscriptions praised Xerxes' conquests, his wealth, his devotion to the gods, while the inner life of the palace vanished from record, especially the suffering of women, whose lives were considered private matters unworthy of stone or ink. And the few clues that survived came not from Persian sources, but from outsiders, Greek historians, exiles, and rivals who had every reason to record what Persia preferred to hide. And among them Herodotus stands out, a man often accused of exaggeration, yet repeatedly confirmed by archaeology in ways that make his most disturbing accounts harder to dismiss. And it is in these fragmented accounts that whispers of her fate appear, never fully named, never directly honored, but hinted at through stories of royal women punished without blood, removed without execution, and condemned to living disappearance. And historians long dismissed these passages as moral drama or foreign propaganda, uncomfortable with the idea that such cruelty could exist at the heart of one of history's most advanced empires. But modern scholarship has begun to re-examine what silence itself means, because absence in ancient records is rarely accidental, especially when patterns repeat. And excavations of palace complexes at Persepolis reveal sealed residential wings, heavily guarded and deliberately isolated, spaces that serve no administrative purpose, places where people could exist unseen. And when combined with court protocols describing strict control over royal women, a darker picture emerges, one in which punishment did not require chains or blades, only time, isolation, and obedience enforced by fear. And this explains why her story feels unreal even now, because it lacks the drama of public execution, yet carries a cruelty far more intimate. And the reason history struggled to preserve it is precisely because it exposed something dangerous, that absolute power does not always destroy through violence, but through systems that normalize suffering until no one questions it. And for centuries, scholars avoided this interpretation because it challenged the heroic narrative of kings and empires, forcing them to confront the human cost hidden behind monuments. And yet, the more closely the fragments are studied, the clearer the pattern becomes that her erasure was intentional, methodical, and successful, at least for a time, until curiosity, archaeology, and uncomfortable questions began to pull at the edges of the silence, revealing that what was forgotten was not insignificant, but unbearable, and that the greatest cruelty committed against her may not have been what she endured, but the fact that the world was taught to forget she ever existed at all, setting the stage for a final truth about Xerxes and power that remains deeply unsettling even today. In the end, the most disturbing truth about her fate is not found in any single act of cruelty, but in what it reveals about power itself, because Xerxes did not need to strike his daughter, imprison her in chains, or order her death to destroy her. All he had to do was allow a system to finish what his words began. And that system, once set in motion, required no further effort from him at all, as it operated quietly, efficiently, and without mercy, transforming a living person into a problem, then into a silence, and finally into nothing. And this is why her story matters far beyond one palace or one king, because it exposes how absolute authority reshapes morality, turning vows into weapons and tradition into an excuse. And Xerxes, remembered by history as a ruler of immense scale and ambition, becomes here something far more unsettling. A man who chose image over blood, reputation over responsibility, and whose greatest act of violence was not what he did openly, but what he allowed to continue unseen. And when viewed through this lens, the famous failures of his reign, the stalled conquests, the rebellions, the cracks in the empire's confidence, take on new meaning, because an empire that consumes its own children cannot remain whole forever. And though his monuments still stand in fragments and his name remains etched into history, the silence around his daughter speaks louder than any inscription, reminding us that power without accountability always demands victims, and those victims are rarely remembered. And this is why ancient historians struggled with stories like hers, because they resist neat conclusions, offering no heroic death, no dramatic reversal, only endurance followed by erasure, a fate that feels deeply uncomfortable even to modern readers. And yet this discomfort is precisely the point, because her story forces us to confront a reality we prefer to avoid. That suffering does not always come from malice, but from indifference protected by authority. And as historians piece together the fragments, sealed rooms, missing names, whispered traditions, the image that emerges is not of a single monstrous act, but of a culture that allowed cruelty to be disguised as order. And in that sense, Xerxes did not merely fail as a father. He demonstrated the ultimate danger of unchecked power, that it convinces those who wield it that their decisions are beyond judgment. And when that belief takes hold, even love becomes expendable. And so her fate stands as a dark reflection on humanity itself, a reminder that the greatest horrors of the past were not always committed in moments of rage or madness, but in calm rooms through accepted rules, applauded decisions, and collective silence. And though her name may never be fully recovered, her story survives as a warning, carved not into stone, but into the uneasy space where history, power, and conscience collide, leaving us to ask not only what Xerxes did, but how many similar stories were lost, simply because no one dared to speak.